I found a hungry alien widow and her little girl stranded on a small island. I became their guardian. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow across the tiny, remote island. The waves lapped gently against the shore, carrying the soft, salty smell of the ocean. For most people, this island would have seemed peaceful and beautiful, a perfect place to escape the chaos of the world. But for one man, it was a place he had come to by accident. He had not planned to spend so much time here. His boat had broken down during a small personal trip, and while waiting for help, he wandered along the sandy shore looking for anything unusual. He walked slowly, taking in the quiet. The island was small, only a few miles across, and covered with a mix of soft sand, rocks, and clusters of trees. Birds chirped in the distance, and crabs scuttled along the beach. It seemed empty, too empty. But then he noticed something odd. A set of footprints led from the water toward the trees. They were not human footprints, and they did not look like animal tracks either. He froze, staring at them. The prints were small, and their shape was strange, almost delicate, but with hints of something unfamiliar, something not from this world. Curiosity mixed with caution as he followed the tracks. Every step brought him closer to the dense trees at the center of the island. He moved carefully, making sure not to make a sound. Then he saw it. A small fire almost out with thin smoke rising into the sky. Near the fire, crouched on the sand, were two figures. One was a woman and the other a little girl, no older than 5 or 6. But they were unlike any humans he had ever seen. Their skin had a faint, shimmering color, and their eyes were larger than normal, reflecting the sunlight in a strange way. Their features were delicate, almost fragile, but there was sadness and fear in their expressions that was unmistakable. The man's heart skipped a beat. He stopped a few meters away, unsure what to do. Should he call out? Would they understand him? More importantly, would they react with anger or fear? He decided to stay silent for a moment, observing. The little girl clutched a small, ragged piece of cloth to her chest, and the woman held her close, whispering words he could not understand. The woman's eyes flicked toward him, wide with alarm. He held his hands up slowly, trying to show that he meant no harm. After a long, tense moment, he spoke softly, his voice calm. "I'm not going to hurt you. I want to help." The woman did not move. She stared at him, her body tense, ready to protect the child. The little girl peeked out from behind her mother, curiosity battling fear in her eyes. It was clear they had been alone on this island for some time. Their clothes were worn, torn in places, and they looked tired, hungry, and weak. He realized that they had survived on very little. His heart went out to them immediately. Slowly, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small package of food he had saved for himself. He knelt down on the sand, keeping his distance, and laid it gently on a flat stone near the fire. "Please," he said, "take this. You need it more than I do." The woman's eyes shifted to the food, then back to him. She hesitated, clearly unsure whether to trust him. The little girl took a small step forward, her tiny hand reaching for the food. Her mother's eyes softened for just a moment, a sign that perhaps she understood he truly wanted to help. The man smiled gently, keeping his voice calm and steady. "You don't have to be afraid. I will not hurt you. My name is Daniel." The woman's lips moved, forming words he could not understand, but her tone seemed cautious rather than angry. She watched him carefully, then slowly gestured toward the food. The little girl reached down, taking a small piece of the bread. Her tiny hands shook as she held it, and then she looked up at him with wide eyes, a mixture of fear and gratitude. Daniel felt a warmth spread through his chest. He had helped people before, but never anyone like this. Never anyone from another world. He realized that they were alone, truly alone, and he was their first chance at safety. He took a slow breath, reminding himself to remain calm. This was a moment that required patience and care. Any wrong move could drive them away forever. Over the next few hours, Daniel stayed near the fire, offering water and food in small amounts. He did not push the woman to speak or explain anything. Instead, he let her observe him, showing through actions that he was kind and patient. The little girl began to smile shyly at him, a small, fragile sign of trust forming. She mimicked some of his gestures, laughing softly when he made a funny face. Daniel felt a smile spread across his own face. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the island, Daniel decided it was time to find a more secure shelter for them. The woman watched him closely, but when he gestured for her and the little girl to follow, they moved slowly but did not run. It was a small victory. He led them through the trees to a small, natural clearing near a cluster of large rocks. The area was safe from the wind and offered some protection from the elements. Using pieces of driftwood and leaves, he began to create a simple, temporary shelter. The woman and little girl watched him, occasionally helping by gathering materials. Daniel could see the relief in their eyes as they realized someone was genuinely looking after them. Night fell, and the island grew quiet, except for the soft sound of waves and the occasional call of a night bird. The fire crackled gently, and Daniel handed the little girl a small blanket. She hugged it tightly, her eyes heavy with sleep. Her mother watched him for a long time, silent but expressive. Finally, she gestured with her hands in a way that Daniel understood as thank you. He nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. This was only the beginning. He had saved them from immediate hunger and fear, but he knew the days ahead would be filled with challenges. They needed food, water, safety, and eventually, a way to leave the island or make it livable for a longer time. Daniel felt a sense of responsibility settle over him. He could not abandon them, not now. That night, as he lay on the sand a few meters from the fire, Daniel thought about how life could change in an instant. One moment, he had been alone on this island, and the next, he had become the guardian of a widow and her child, strangers from a world he could hardly imagine. His mind raced with questions. Who were they? How had they ended up here? And most importantly, how could he ensure their safety and trust? The little girl stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. Her mother's arm was wrapped around her, protective and gentle. Daniel watched them for a long time, feeling a mixture of awe, fear, and determination. He did not know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he could not leave them alone. The first step was simple: survive tonight, gain trust, and continue to show kindness. Tomorrow, he would explore more of the island, find fresh water, and look for other resources. But tonight, he would stay by the fire, ensuring that the widow and her daughter slept safely. Hours passed, and the moon rose high, bathing the island in a soft silver light. The waves whispered against the shore, and the fire burned low. Daniel kept watch, thinking about how fragile life could be, how small acts of care could make a huge difference, and how a single decision could change the course of not just his life, but theirs as well. He realized that this encounter, unexpected and surreal, was a turning point. The island was no longer just a place of isolation for him. It had become a place of responsibility, of hope, and of connection. The alien widow and her little girl were not just survivors. They were now a part of his life, and he a part of theirs. And in that quiet, moonlit night, Daniel promised himself that he would protect them, guide them, and do everything in his power to help them survive. No matter how difficult the days ahead might be, he knew that this small island had brought them together for a reason, and he was ready to face whatever challenges awaited. The morning light broke over the island, scattering golden beams across the sand and trees. Daniel woke to the soft sound of the waves and the rustling of leaves. The little girl had already stirred and was sitting up near the small fire, rubbing her eyes. She looked at him briefly and then turned to her mother, who was still resting, her face calm but watchful. Daniel stretched and carefully got up, mindful not to startle them. Last night had been tense but hopeful. They had survived the first night together, and that alone was an important step. He knew the day ahead would require patience. Trust could not be forced. It had to grow slowly, step by step. He moved quietly, collecting some dried leaves and small sticks for the fire. The little girl followed him, her small feet stepping softly on the sand. When she reached out to touch his hand, he gently squeezed it, giving her a reassuring smile. She giggled softly, a sound so fragile yet full of life, and ran back to her mother, bringing a tiny bundle of leaves with her as if she were helping. Daniel realized that communication would take time. They could not speak the same language, but gestures, expressions, and small acts of kindness could bridge the gap. He decided that today his goal was simple: show them that he was safe, reliable, and capable of keeping them fed and protected. He started by gathering fruits and edible plants from the nearby trees. He had noticed some berries and a few strange-looking roots the previous day, but had been too cautious to touch them. Now, with a little experimentation and observation, he felt confident they could be eaten. Carefully, he collected what he could carry back to their small shelter. When he returned, the little girl ran to meet him, her eyes wide with curiosity. She pointed to the berries, tilting her head as if asking, "What is this?" Daniel smiled and held one out to her. She hesitated, glancing at her mother. The woman nodded slowly, a small gesture of approval, and the girl plucked the berry from his hand and tasted it. Her eyes lit up and she held out her hand for more. Daniel laughed softly. The sound seemed to comfort them. The woman finally spoke a few words, softly, almost like a whisper. Daniel did not understand, but her tone was calmer now, less fearful. He nodded in response, letting her know that he was listening and willing to try to understand. The day passed slowly, each moment an opportunity to build trust. Daniel taught the little girl how to catch small crabs in the shallow water, using simple movements to show her how to reach carefully and gently. She tried, her tiny hands clumsy at first, but she laughed every time she caught one, proud of her small success. The woman watched silently, her face showing a mixture of caution and quiet relief. She began to let her guard down, seeing that Daniel cared for her child and had no harmful intentions. By mid-afternoon, the trio sat near the fire, sharing the small meal Daniel had prepared. The woman ate sparingly at first, but eventually she took more, encouraged by the little girl's joyful eating. Daniel observed them carefully, noticing how the woman's body relaxed and how she occasionally glanced at him with a quiet, appreciative expression. It was progress. Small, simple, but real progress. After the meal, Daniel decided to explore the island further. He wanted to find fresh water and perhaps more shelter materials. He gestured to the woman and the girl, inviting them to come along, but they shook their heads. They stayed near the fire, their safety their priority. Daniel understood and promised to return quickly. As he walked through the trees, he discovered a small stream hidden behind a cluster of rocks. The water was clear and clean, a perfect source for drinking and cooking. He collected some water in a large leaf, careful not to spill it, and made his way back to the shelter. When he returned, the little girl ran to him, eyes wide, as if sensing that he had found something important. He poured the water into a small container and showed it to the woman, who nodded with understanding. That evening, as the sun began to set, Daniel sat with the widow and her daughter. They sat close together, the little girl leaning against her mother, and he watched the quiet bond forming between them. It was a fragile trust, but it was real. The woman still spoke words he could not understand, but now she smiled occasionally and used gestures to communicate. Over the next few days, Daniel focused on establishing a routine. He gathered food, collected water, and built a more secure shelter using larger branches and leaves. The woman began helping, showing him how to weave leaves into the roof, her movements careful but efficient. The little girl played nearby, occasionally mimicking their actions, her laughter filling the air. Daniel noticed that the little girl had a habit of pointing to different things and making small sounds. He realized that she was trying to communicate, to share her thoughts and needs. He began responding with gestures, nodding, shaking his head, or pointing to objects, slowly developing a simple form of language between them. The woman observed, approving of his patience and effort. One afternoon, while collecting fruits, Daniel saw dark clouds gathering on the horizon. He knew a storm was approaching and hurried back to the shelter. The woman and the girl were already preparing as best they could, moving inside and securing the leaves and branches. Daniel helped, tying branches and reinforcing the structure. When the first drops of rain began to fall, they all huddled inside, the storm roaring outside. The storm lasted for hours, the wind howling and rain drenching the island. Daniel kept a hand on the little girl's shoulder, comforting her as she trembled. The woman leaned close to her child, whispering softly. Daniel did not understand the words, but he understood the emotion, fear, concern, and love. He felt a deep respect for her, realizing how much strength it took to care for her child in such a harsh environment. When the storm finally passed, the island was quiet again. Daniel emerged from the shelter, checking the area for damage. The little girl followed, curious and cautious. The woman stayed behind for a moment, then stepped out, nodding at him. Their eyes met, and in that simple gesture, Daniel felt a bond stronger than words. The following days were filled with small victories. They found more edible plants, discovered a small cave for additional shelter, and Daniel taught the little girl simple survival skills. How to gather food, where to find safe drinking water, and how to move carefully around the island. The widow continued to watch closely, occasionally helping and sometimes retreating to the background. But it was clear that she trusted him more each day. Daniel began to notice little things. The way the girl laughed when he made funny gestures, the way the woman's shoulders relaxed when he approached, the small smiles that appeared more frequently. These were signs that trust was growing, slowly but surely. He also realized that this island, once a place of solitude and uncertainty, had become a home, a place where three lives were beginning to intertwine. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel sat near the fire with them. The little girl had fallen asleep, her head resting on her mother's lap. The woman looked at him, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. She reached out a hand, gently touching his arm. He understood it as a gesture of gratitude, respect, and perhaps the first hint of friendship. Daniel smiled softly, feeling a warmth in his chest. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging. There would be storms, hunger, and countless moments of uncertainty. But he also knew that they were no longer alone, and neither was he. Together, they could face whatever the island and life threw at them. That night, as they slept under the shelter of leaves and branches, Daniel stayed awake a little longer, watching the stars above. He thought about the journey that had brought them together and the bond that was forming, delicate but real. He realized that sometimes, family was not defined by blood but by care, trust, and shared experience. And here on this small, remote island, a new family was beginning to take shape. In the days that followed, Daniel continued his careful work. He explored the island more thoroughly, ensuring they had safe places to sleep and gather food. He taught the little girl simple games to keep her entertained and engaged, and he helped the widow with small tasks, showing her that he could be relied upon. Slowly, the three of them fell into a rhythm, a simple routine that made life on the island manageable and even joyful in its own small way. The story of trust, patience, and care was unfolding, day by day, gesture by gesture. Daniel realized that this was not just about survival. It was about connection, about finding humanity in the most unexpected places. And as the sun rose and set each day, he felt a quiet sense of hope. The alien widow and her little girl were no longer strangers. They were becoming his family, and he was theirs. Days passed on the small island, and life began to settle into a quiet rhythm. Daniel, the widow, and the little girl had grown more comfortable with each other. The little girl laughed more freely, and the woman's cautious glances toward Daniel had softened into subtle nods of trust. They had built a routine, gathering food, collecting water, maintaining their small shelters, and exploring the island in careful measures. But life on the island was far from easy, and Daniel knew that the island could be unpredictable. One morning, the sky was gray, heavy with clouds that hinted at a storm approaching. Daniel noticed the wind picking up, bending the trees and sending leaves swirling across the sand. He called the woman over, pointing toward the sky and using gestures to communicate his concern. She looked at him carefully, then at the little girl, whose eyes were wide with curiosity and a hint of fear. Daniel motioned for her to stay near the shelter. As the first drops of rain began to fall, the wind grew stronger. Daniel moved quickly to reinforce the shelters. He tied branches more securely and layered leaves to block the rain. The woman helped him, working silently but efficiently while keeping the little girl close. The girl clung to her mother, peeking occasionally at Daniel, who was moving between them and the small structures to make sure everything would hold. By midday, the rain had turned into a heavy downpour, and the island began to feel dangerous. Trees swayed violently, and small branches broke off, falling to the ground with sharp cracks. Daniel felt his heart tighten. Survival was one thing, but protecting the little girl in such conditions was another. He motioned for the woman to help guide the girl into the largest shelter he had reinforced, one that offered protection from wind and rain. She did as he asked, her movements careful, her eyes focused on the child. For hours, the storm raged. Daniel kept watch outside, ensuring that no branches fell dangerously close to the shelter and that water did not seep through the roof. Inside, the woman held her daughter tightly, whispering soothing words in her own language. Daniel could not understand them, but the warmth and care in her voice were unmistakable. The little girl's small hand reached out to him, and he placed his own hand over hers, feeling the delicate pulse of fear and trust combined. The storm continued into the evening. Daniel had barely eaten, focusing all his energy on keeping them safe. Every crack of thunder made the little girl flinch, and Daniel would gently pat her back or tilt his head in a reassuring gesture. The woman began to relax slightly, seeing that Daniel was not only capable, but committed to protecting her child. The shared experience of fear and survival created an unspoken bond between them. When the storm finally passed, the island was soaked, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and salt. Fallen branches and scattered leaves littered the ground, evidence of the storm's force. Daniel stepped outside, assessing the damage. He noticed that some of the smaller shelters had collapsed, and some food they had gathered earlier was ruined. The situation was challenging, but it was also an opportunity to show the widow and her daughter that he could help them rebuild and survive. He motioned for them to come outside, pointing toward the damaged areas. The little girl looked hesitant, but the woman nodded and followed him. Daniel began picking up fallen branches and gathering what could be salvaged. The woman assisted, her movements careful and deliberate. She even smiled slightly when Daniel handed her a large branch, showing that despite the exhaustion and fear, there was hope. As they worked together, Daniel noticed a small stream had overflowed due to the rain. The water was cleaner now, fresh from the heavy rainfall, but it had shifted the landscape slightly. Daniel realized that their routines would need to change. Some areas of the island were now unsafe, and they would need to adapt. He used gestures to explain to the woman and the little girl that they would need to move certain activities, like cooking and collecting water, to safer spots. By evening, they had rebuilt their shelter as best as they could. It was not perfect, but it was secure. Daniel gathered what food remained and cooked a simple meal for them. The little girl sat close to her mother, but this time she reached for Daniel's hand, taking small bites of the food he had prepared. The woman watched, a mixture of relief and gratitude in her eyes. Daniel smiled quietly, knowing that despite the challenges, they had survived together. The following days were spent repairing and strengthening their shelters, gathering more food and finding ways to make the island safer. Daniel explored the island more thoroughly, marking areas that could be dangerous during storms or high tides. The little girl helped by collecting small branches and leaves, learning through play how to survive. The widow began to contribute more actively, showing that she trusted Daniel's judgment and was willing to work alongside him rather than merely observing. One afternoon, while Daniel was gathering food near the edge of the island, he noticed a small fire in the distance. His heart leapt. Was there another human nearby, or was it another threat? He approached cautiously, signaling for the woman and the little girl to stay behind. As he got closer, he realized it was only a small signal fire, abandoned or left by someone who had passed by recently. It was a reminder that while the island was isolated, it was not entirely empty. Survival could be aided if they were careful, and perhaps eventually it could lead to rescue. Back at the shelter, Daniel shared his findings through gestures, pointing to the fire and then to the horizon. The woman seemed thoughtful, and the little girl tilted her head, clearly trying to understand. Daniel smiled and pointed to the small shelter and the food they had collected, emphasizing safety and patience. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting both concern and understanding. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Daniel decided to teach the little girl a simple game to keep her engaged and strengthen their bond. Using stones and sticks, he showed her how to arrange them in patterns. She laughed when the stones fell or when he pretended to lose the game. The woman watched silently, smiling occasionally. It was in these small, quiet moments that trust deepened and a sense of family began to form. But life on the island was not without its dangers. One morning, Daniel noticed that the tide had come in higher than usual. Parts of the shelter were wet, and some of their food had been washed away. He quickly gathered the remaining supplies and moved them to higher ground. The widow and the little girl helped, carrying small bundles under his direction. Daniel explained through gestures that they must always be aware of the tides, and that preparation was essential for survival. Over time, Daniel began to understand more about the widow and her daughter. He learned that they had not always been alone, that they had lost someone important before arriving on the island. While he could not understand the details of her language, he sensed the depth of her grief and the strength it took for her to care for her child. His respect for her grew daily. The little girl began to show signs of learning new words through gestures and sounds. Daniel encouraged her, responding with smiles and nods. He could see that she was beginning to feel safe, that she trusted him not just as a provider but as someone who cared deeply for her well-being. The widow observed this, and Daniel noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. Less caution, more acceptance, and quiet gratitude. One afternoon, while exploring a rocky part of the island, Daniel discovered a small cave that could serve as additional shelter during storms. He returned to the main shelter and pointed toward the cave, showing the woman and the little girl that it could be a safe place. The woman seemed hesitant at first, but Daniel demonstrated its safety, and she eventually nodded. The little girl clapped her hands in excitement, understanding that this new space could be a game and a refuge. The days grew longer, and the island became more familiar. Daniel, the widow, and the little girl developed a routine of work, exploration, and small moments of play. They celebrated little successes, finding a new fruit, repairing a shelter, or discovering a safe place to swim. Each day reinforced their trust in one another and their ability to survive together. Yet Daniel knew that challenges would continue. The island was unpredictable, and their survival depended on vigilance, cooperation, and trust. He remained alert, ready to protect the little girl and support the widow, knowing that their bond had grown stronger because of the trials they had faced. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the sand, Daniel sat with the widow and the little girl. They watched the waves together, silent but connected. The little girl leaned against her mother, and the woman reached out to place a hand on Daniel's shoulder. He understood the gesture perfectly: acknowledgement, trust, and a bond that had been forged through shared hardship. Daniel smiled softly, feeling the weight and warmth of responsibility. He knew the island had tested them, and they had passed those tests together. The storm, the tides, and the daily challenges had not broken them. Instead, they had become stronger, more united, and more resilient. As night fell, Daniel prepared for another long night of watchfulness. He had learned that survival on the island required not just physical strength, but patience, empathy, and understanding. The widow and the little girl slept peacefully under the reinforced shelter, trusting that he would keep them safe. And in that trust, Daniel found a profound sense of purpose. Life on the small island had begun to settle into a new rhythm for Daniel, the widow, and her little daughter. After surviving the storm and facing the unpredictable challenges of the island, they had found a fragile sense of stability. But it was more than survival. It was a kind of life that included trust, laughter, and moments of quiet joy. The island, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had slowly started to feel like home. Every morning, Daniel woke with the sun, listening to the gentle rush of waves and the soft calls of birds. The little girl would already be awake, peeking from behind her mother's side, her bright eyes full of curiosity. She would giggle quietly when Daniel smiled at her, and sometimes she would imitate his movements, trying to follow his actions during daily tasks. The widow, now calmer and more trusting, watched them both carefully, often offering small nods or gestures that communicated appreciation and approval. Daniel had begun to establish a more structured routine for the day. He would start by checking the shelters for safety, making sure the reinforced branches and leaves were secure. Then he would gather food, fruits, berries, and edible plants before heading to the stream for fresh water. The little girl often tagged along, carrying small bundles of leaves or twigs, while the widow followed at a cautious distance. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm, but one that gave them a sense of security and purpose. One morning, Daniel decided to teach the little girl how to catch small fish from the shallow water. He had made a small fishing tool from sticks and vines, simple but effective. He demonstrated carefully, showing her how to dip the stick into the water and gently guide the fish into a makeshift trap. The little girl tried, her hands clumsy at first, but her determination was remarkable. When she finally caught her first tiny fish, her eyes lit up with pride and she clapped her hands. The widow, standing nearby, smiled softly. It was a quiet acknowledgement that they were learning, surviving, and slowly thriving together. As the days passed, Daniel and the widow began working together more openly. She helped him repair shelters, collect water, and even identify edible plants. Though she spoke a language he could not understand, her gestures and expressions communicated clearly. She pointed to certain fruits, smiled when Daniel nodded in agreement, and occasionally laughed when he made mistakes or did something unusual. The little girl watched them, absorbing everything, and soon began mimicking both their actions. Their lives were not without small moments of joy. Daniel had found some smooth stones along the shore, and showed the little girl how to stack them carefully to make little towers. She laughed when the towers toppled over, and he laughed with her, feeling a warmth he had not experienced in a long time. The widow watched silently, sometimes smiling, sometimes just observing, but Daniel could sense that she too was beginning to feel a sense of belonging and calm. One afternoon, Daniel decided to explore a part of the island he had not visited before. He motioned to the widow and little girl, inviting them to come along, but they shook their heads. He understood. They preferred the safety of the main shelter. He left small markers along the path, leaves and stones arranged in patterns, so that they could find the way back if they ever followed. This small act of care demonstrated not just survival skills, but thoughtfulness and consideration for their safety. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with shades of pink and gold, Daniel prepared a small meal of fruits, fish, and edible roots. The little girl helped by holding small containers and mimicking his movements. The widow moved closer this time, accepting a small portion of food he offered her with a nod. For the first time, there was a sense of shared enjoyment around the fire, a quiet acknowledgement that life could be pleasant even in such unusual circumstances. The following days were filled with small victories and learning experiences. Daniel taught the little girl simple games that helped her coordination and focus, such as stacking leaves, sorting stones by size, and following paths he drew in the sand. She laughed frequently, her joy contagious, and the widow began participating in these activities occasionally, showing signs of trust and acceptance. These moments created a rhythm of life that was both practical and joyful, blending survival with play and learning. Daniel also started to notice the widow's habits and routines. She had a careful way of arranging things, a methodical approach to gathering and storing food, and an instinct for safety that was sharp and precise. He realized that her skills complemented his own, and together they could manage much more than either could alone. The little girl became the bridge between them, her laughter and curiosity encouraging both adults to cooperate and care for one another more deeply. One day, while gathering fresh water from the stream, Daniel discovered a small patch of wild berries that were both abundant and safe to eat. He returned quickly, excited to share the discovery. The little girl ran to meet him, her small hands reaching for the berries, while the widow followed with cautious interest. Together, they collected the berries, filling small containers. It was a simple task, yet it felt like a triumph, a reminder that even small victories could bring joy and hope. As the sun set that evening, Daniel sat near the fire, the little girl on his lap, and the widow nearby. The warmth of the fire, the soft sounds of the waves, and the quiet connection between them created a sense of peace. Daniel realized that this island, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a home. Not just a physical shelter, but a place where trust, care, and connection existed. Over time, they began to create small rituals that reinforced their bond. Each morning, they would greet the day together, checking the shelters and preparing for the tasks ahead. Meals became shared experiences, with each of them contributing in their own way. Playtime, learning, and exploration were woven into the daily routine, creating a balance between survival and comfort. Even simple gestures, sharing a smile, holding hands, or pointing out something interesting, became moments of connection and trust. Daniel also made efforts to teach the little girl about the world around her. He showed her how to recognize safe fruits, how to find fresh water, and how to identify potential dangers. The little girl absorbed everything eagerly, her young mind curious and open. The widow watched, occasionally intervening with her own knowledge, correcting small mistakes, or offering guidance. The collaborative effort created a sense of shared responsibility and mutual respect. One day, while exploring a rocky area near the shore, Daniel discovered a natural pool formed by the tides. The water was calm and clear, and he motioned for the little girl to come closer. She hesitated at first, but Daniel's encouraging gestures reassured her. Together, they explored the pool, finding small fish and colorful stones. The widow observed from a safe distance, smiling softly as she watched her daughter engage with Daniel. It was a moment of joy and discovery, a reminder that even in isolation, life could be beautiful. As weeks passed, their connection grew stronger. The little girl learned to communicate through a combination of gestures, sounds, and simple words. Daniel responded patiently, encouraging her attempts and helping her express her needs. The widow began to participate more actively, offering guidance, teaching the girls small skills, and sharing the burden of daily survival. Their relationship evolved from cautious cooperation to mutual trust, respect, and care. One evening, as the sun set and the sky was painted with deep orange and purple hues, Daniel sat by the fire with them. The little girl played nearby, arranging stones in patterns, while the widow rested with a soft smile. Daniel reflected on how much had changed since he first found them. They had survived storms, adapted to the island, and built a small life together. But more importantly, they had created a family, a bond that transcended language, culture, and even species. Daniel realized that the little girl and her mother had given him something profound, a sense of purpose and connection. In caring for them, he had discovered his own capacity for patience, empathy, and love. They had become more than just survivors on a small island. They had become a unit, a family in the truest sense of the word. The little girl, noticing Daniel's thoughtful expression, reached out and held his hand. He smiled and squeezed her hand gently, feeling the warmth and trust she offered. The widow watched silently, her eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. It was a moment of unspoken communication, a reminder that even in the most challenging circumstances, love and trust could flourish. From that day on, their life on the island became more harmonious. They continued to explore, learn, and grow together. Daniel taught the little girl new games, survival skills, and ways to enjoy the small wonders of the island. The widow contributed her own knowledge and care, guiding both Daniel and her daughter with wisdom and patience. Together, they built a life that was simple, yet filled with meaning, connection, and love. Even in isolation, they discovered joy in each other's presence. The little girl's laughter echoed across the shore. The widow's quiet smiles became more frequent, and Daniel felt a deep sense of fulfillment in his role as guardian and protector. The island, once a place of uncertainty and fear, had become a home, a sanctuary where trust, care, and family thrived.